started Psalm 35. I read the first 10 verses last week, and we're going to read the next 11 verses. So, Psalm 35, beginning in verse 11. Malicious witnesses rise up. They ask me about things I do not know. They repay me evil for good. My soul is forlorn. But as for me, when they were sick, I wore sackcloth. I afflicted myself with fasting. I prayed with head bowed on my bosom, as though I grieved for a friend or a brother. I went about as one who laments for a mother, bowed down and in mourning. But at my stumbling they gathered in glee. They gathered together against me. Griffins whom I did not know tore at me without ceasing. They impiously mocked more and more, gnashing at me with their teeth. How long, O Lord, will you look on? Rescue me from their ravages, my life from the lions. Then I will thank you in the great congregation. In the mighty throng I will praise you. Do not let my treacherous enemies rejoice over me. For those who hate me without cause wink the eye. For they do not speak peace, but they conceive deceitful words against those who are quiet in the land. They open wide their mouths against me. They say, Aha, our eyes have seen. Lord, we pray for your Spirit to be present among us this morning. It's in your Son's name we pray. All right, so in our series, as we have been talking about how we got the Bible, last week we did a very brief overview of about 300 years between the conclusion of the the conclusion of the writings of the New Testament and when it becomes canonized, when the 27 books of the New Testament kind of get agreed upon as the 27 books of the New Testament. And we talked about how early on there wasn't a reason for this because everyone just kind of knew and they had these books and they were using them and they became important in worship. But as false teaching arose, so as people started putting together books that the church knew, well, those aren't the right books, they then had to answer the question, well, what are the right books? If those are the wrong books, then what are the right books? And so that led people over the course of the next several hundred years to begin putting together lists of books. And we talked about how people from the East and from the West, and they all begin to put together books. And most of those lists include the same books. Some of them include a few apocryphal works. And then there were a few books that were constantly debated. Hebrews, Revelation, sometimes James, Jude, 2nd and 3rd Peter are some of the books that get debated by some. But the vast majority, so we're talking about like 90% of the New Testament, was on like every list from the very beginning. You have a small number of books that begin to be debated. And then in the year 397, in the Council of Carthage, the council kind of ratifies those 27 books and agrees that these are the 27 books of the New Testament. These are 27 inspired books that are to guide the church. And we also talked about how that wasn't just them deciding, well, what books do we like? It was them asking questions of what books for the past 300 years have been life-giving to the church, because that's what it means for a book to be inspired, is to give life. What books has God for 300 years been giving life to the church? And so it wasn't a choosing of the New Testament, it was a recognition of the New Testament, which is a big difference. Council didn't just choose what books they liked, they recognized what books God had already inspired. And so that leads to the question and the discussion of books that were left out, books that were not included. And that's kind of where we left off last week. All right, we left off last last week talking about the Apocrypha. I gave y'all a handout last week. I've got some more in the back if you left yours here. If you forgot to bring it back if you weren't here. So kind of raise your hand and Cherie can get you a handout so you can Yes, when we can do grades at the end of the class.
In that case, Professor, I didn't forget it. I took a picture. It's on my phone.
That seems to be where I left it.
That's a possibility.
You know,
I got mine right beside my purse on the kitchen table. That's where it is. Oh, I got the purse.
She handed that to me this morning.
Can we borrow one?
Yeah. And hopefully this is the last week that will be in this packet, but in 3 weeks I've got another packet, and I think that one's longer.
Well, I've even read over it.
I've been using the same packet in the teen class on Wednesday nights. We've been doing some different stuff with it than the way that we're talking about it in here, but every time I give them a packet and they slowly grow longer, the teens freak out. But they end up enjoying it by the end, I promise. So I'm hoping that's the same with you guys. Okay, so the Apocrypha is a collection of books that are not found, we talked about, in Protestant Bibles. The Old Testament Apocrypha is included in Catholic Bibles. In Catholic Bibles, they're called the Deuterocanonical books. Deutero meaning second, canon meaning like we talked about, rule of faith or something like that. So it's, for Catholics, the Apocrypha is a second canon. So it is canon, it is rule of faith, it is inspired, but it's second. So it's not on equal footing with the rest of the New Testament. That's sometimes what we get wrong when we talk about Catholicism, is that we might talk about they believe in all these other books, and we talk about how they hold them like they do the rest of the scriptures. That's not true. The 66 books of our Bible are more important, more central in Catholicism, but these books are included in their Bibles. Apocrypha means hidden things, and so the idea is that these books have things that are hidden, things that are being revealed by the author. If you were to ever read a book on the Apocrypha, one of the things they'll talk about is that it's a bad name, because you get all these books that are thrown into this collection, but not all of them follow that definition. They're not all hidden things being revealed. Some of them, like 1st and 2nd Maccabees, are just history books. They're not revealing anything hidden. They're telling things that are known, or at least kind of known, because it is kind of a biased retelling of history. Last week, I wanted us to just kind of get into this discussion, and we looked at the story of Tobit. A quick reminder of the story of Tobit. Tobit is a blind man who lives in Nineveh. And how are you? Good, good. Good to see you. Good to have you here.
We know you now.
You'll be soon.
Yeah. So the story of Tobit. Tobit's a blind man. He lives in Nineveh. He sends his son Tobias to get some money that he's hidden away. Tobias meets this woman named Sarah. Sarah has this demon who has fallen in love with her named Asmodeus. And what the demon does is that Sarah will get married, and on their wedding night, when they will enter into the marriage chamber to consummate the marriage, Asmodeus will kill the husband. And this happens 7 times. And so the story concludes with the archangel Raphael, I believe. Yes, Raphael aids Sarah and Tobias in getting rid of the demon, and they do it by they catch this fish and they cut it open and they burn the entrails, and the smell is so bad that it scares the demon away. And then they return back to Nineveh and they help Tobit get his sight back. We began with that story because I mentioned how the books of the Apocrypha are helpful. They are written, most of them, between, if you think, this is an oversimplification, but if you think about these books being written between the end of the Old Testament and through the ministry of Jesus, let's say, so they give us insight into what Jews are thinking, what Jews are believing, what Jews are talking about leading up to the time of Jesus. And this comes to play in us understanding things in the New Testament. So I mentioned Sarah gets married 7 times, and this demon kills all 7 husbands, which is an interesting story because if you go to Matthew chapter 22, some Sadducees come up to Jesus. And if you remember, the Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection. And so they try to trick Jesus about the resurrection, and they ask Jesus, they say, so according to the law, if a woman's husband dies, then the husband's brother has the responsibility to marry her. And then they say that there was this woman who had 7 husbands, and all 7 husbands died. Who is she going to be married to in the resurrection? I find it interesting that they talk about this woman who's had 7 husbands, and we know of a book that Jews were reading at the time with a woman who had 7 husbands who all died, and that's the book of Tobit. We don't know it for sure because nothing specific is given to us by Matthew, but it's likely that the Sadducees are referring to the story of Tobit, that the woman that they're talking about is Sarah, and they're asking this question of, hey, Jesus, we know this story about this woman, and all 7 of her husbands died. It might not just be this hypothetical. It would actually carry more weight for the Sadducees to refer to an actual story that everybody knows, whether or not people believed it to be true or just a made-up story to make a point, kind of like Jesus' parables or something like that. But it's...
The second or third, complicated him.
Yes, I mean, you would... And it's it's an interesting story, and I think it's helpful I wanted to show how it's helpful for our understanding of the New Testament. And that leads me, I want to talk a little bit about 1st and 2nd Maccabees. 1st and 2nd Maccabees, I think, might be the most important books of the Apocrypha for our understanding of the New Testament. So, 1st and 2nd Maccabees tell the biased story of Seleucid occupation of Judea, leading to the Maccabean revolt led by the Hasmonean family, providing semi-independence for the Jews in Jerusalem. I think I've told this story before, but we're going to go over some of the key events. If you remember the history of Israel, Israel begins United Kingdom, Saul, David, and Solomon. The kingdom divides. The northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah, where Jerusalem is located. Eventually, they run through kings. Most of them are wicked and evil, and eventually God has enough, and he lets them be captured. First, the northern kingdom of Israel is conquered by the Assyrians. They assimilate into the Assyrian Empire, and those people are really no more. The bloodline's lost. The southern kingdom of Judah are conquered by the Babylonians. The Babylonians' method of capture, when they capture another nation, is they bring all the people they think will be helpful back to Babylon. So that's why you see in the story of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, these young, educated men that they bring back to Babylon because they're like, these men we can use for something, that they can help us. And so young men like that, slaves, people who had a trade, anyone that could benefit the Babylonian Empire was brought back to Babylon, and it left a small remnant in Jerusalem, Judea, that area, right? So that's the story of Daniel. They're taken away into Babylon. Well, the Babylonians are then conquered by the Persians. The Persians had a different way of dealing with captured people. They thought that you could control the nations that you've captured better by allowing them to stay in their land to hold on to their heritage, in essence, make them happy, you just leave a Persian ruler to oversee what's going on and make sure that they're following Persian law and things like that. So, when the Persians conquer, they send everyone back. And so that's the return from exile. Ezra and Nehemiah are examples of that. They return back, they build the wall around Jerusalem, they rebuild the temple because the exiles are now allowed to return back home, to celebrate their customs, to write out their history. They're still under the control of the Persians, but they're now back in their homeland, and they've somewhat rebuilt the temple. That is why the Judaism that characterizes exile, so when the Israelites go into exile, all the way up to the destruction of the temple in the year 70 AD, that segment of Judaism is called Second Temple Judaism. It's Judaism that existed after the first temple was destroyed, and mostly during the period of a second temple. So, the Persians allowed them to go back, and then the Persians are conquered by the Greeks, specifically Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great conquers pretty much all of the known world at that point in time. He spreads the Greek language, which is why the New Testament's written in Greek. He spreads Greek culture and Greek customs throughout the world. When Alexander dies, his kingdom is turned over to his 4 generals. And so,
How old was he at this time?
when Alexander died, I have no idea. Does anybody know how old Alexander was when he?
Alexander had the same mindset as far as keep the people happy, didn't he?
Yeah, it was because the Jews got to stay in their land for the rest of the time. Now, what happens and what's interesting when you look at some of the cultural dynamics when you get to the time of the first century is that you have what are called diaspora Jews, which is Jews that have moved throughout the world during they were either moved there during the exile or during the time of the Greeks and the Romans, they moved elsewhere. And so they're Jews who are not living in the area of Judea. So Philo, a very famous Jew who did a lot of important writing at the same time as Paul. So he was a contemporary with Paul, but he lived in Alexandria. So he was in Egypt, Alexandria, Egypt being a hub for like scholarship and philosophy and things like that. So, but diaspora Jews tended to be more accepting of Greek culture than the Jews who were living in Judea. The Jews living in Judea and Jerusalem tended to not want to accept and to push back against the Greek culture that people like Alexander the Great had spread throughout the world. But then you had an interesting thing going on within Judaism between a group of Jews called the Amharites, which means the people of the land. And so you remember when the Babylonians take everyone that they think is important and helpful to Babylon, and they leave everyone else in Jerusalem. Well, those people left in Jerusalem and Judea begin to intermarry and intermingle and trade with the people around them, just for survival. And so, in doing that, they kind of leave behind some of the customs of the ancestors, right? And some of the things that they are doing. And a lot of that was just for survival. They had to leave behind some of the laws and customs that they were supposed to be following. So the people of the land, people that were left behind, were viewed as disloyal and unrighteous and unfaithful. And so you had these debates going on within Judaism of what does it look like to be a faithful Jew. You had the Jews in Judea that had returned from exile that were very, very strict. And you can think of the major sects that existed. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes. Very strict. This is what it looks like to be a faithful Jew. You have diaspora Jews that were like, you can accept certain things of Greek culture and still be a faithful Jew. It's not one or the other. You can find ways to intermingle those. Philo of Alexandria is a prime example. He actually takes Greek philosophy and uses it to interpret the Hebrew scriptures. And then you also have the Amharites, the people who had left behind some of the customs in order to survive. And so you have the view of, we're still faithful Jews, we just had to do what we had to do in order to survive, while the rest of y'all were off in Babylon. So you have this interesting dynamic that's going on by the time you get to the 1st century. But within all of this going on, when Alexander turns his empire over to his 4 generals, the Seleucids end up running the area of Judea and Jerusalem, where the Jews are. And eventually, this man, by the name of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, is the king who's running that part of the empire. That includes Judea and Samaria and Jerusalem. And so where all Galilee, where all the Jews are located. And he decides that he wants to invade Egypt. And if you're familiar with a map, Jerusalem and Judea, Samaria, Galilee, all of that is not very far from Egypt. Egypt is just kind of around the corner. So he decides he wants to expand his control. He's going to conquer Egypt. This point in time, the Romans control Egypt, but the Romans haven't conquered the world at this point in time. But they do, they're starting to become very powerful, and they control Egypt. So Antiochus IV Epiphanes goes down to Egypt, and he gets utterly destroyed. And they, I think the legend goes that the Roman general drew a line and said, to Antiochus, if you ever cross this line, I'm going to take your head off, or something like that. They embarrassed him. And so he goes back home embarrassed and angry. And because he's angry, when he comes back home, everywhere that he passes through, he just kind of leads a reign of terror behind him. And so when he gets back to the area of Judea and Jerusalem, he attacks Jerusalem, and Apollonius, his general, slaughters a ton of inhabitants of Jerusalem, a ton of Jews. He constructs what's called the Acra, which is a station for troops. So he builds in essence, living quarters for a bunch of troops in Jerusalem. So he comes back through, he kills a bunch of Jews, and then he stations his troops in Jerusalem. And then he enforces Hellenization. Hellenization is the terms for the acceptance of Greek culture. If you accept Greek culture, you are Hellenized. So a Hellenized Jew is a Jew who has accepted Greek culture. So he forces Greek culture, and by doing that, he outlaws Judaism. So it's illegal to circumcise your sons. You would be forced to eat a non-kosher diet. It was illegal to celebrate your holidays and festivals, to offer your sacrifices, to pretty much everything about Judaism he outlaws. And he says, you can't do that anymore. You have to do all this Greek stuff. And then it hits its pinnacle when he goes into the Jewish temple and offers a sacrifice to a Greek god. And so he defiles the temple. And all of this makes the Jews very angry. You can imagine that. And so there's a family called the Hasmoneans. The Hasmoneans have a bloodline of the priests. They come from the priestly line. Yes?
Was he the one that put a statue of Zeus in the temple?
Yes. Yes. So you put an idol, you begin to worship things to the idol to a false god. And that's likely so Daniel talks about an abomination of desolation. That's what many scholars believe that Daniel was talking about, was this a defiling of the temple that Epiphanes does.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think there's two different instances that that reference occurs, and the second one is, was it Claudius, who puts a statue of himself in?
I believe it's Claudius,
Yeah.
moves a statue of himself, yeah.
So that was the two different instances, and,
Because then Jesus picks that up, and then I think Jesus is probably thinking about Claudius doing something similar to what Epiphanes had done, that Daniel had predicted would happen in the temples defiled, and so the Hasmoneans, this priestly family, they decide we're done with this, and we're going to kick the Greeks out. And oddly enough, they're successful in doing that. And they use guerrilla warfare, and they destroy the Acra, they take the temple back, they kick the Greeks out, and they establish a semi-kingdom of Israel again. And I say semi because what happens is the Hasmonean sons end up kind of running and ruling for a period of time, and so they kind of have independence. Like the Jews kick all foreigners out of Jerusalem and the surrounding area, and they're running things. But the reason is that the Greeks try to take it back, and they're not that successful at first, but they could have. Like, they could have sent everyone and just wiped the Jews out. The thought was, it's not worth it. They're not really causing us problems. It's not worth the time and the energy and the money and the personnel to deal with this. So we're just kind of let them do their thing, and as long as it doesn't bother us, we're not going to worry about it. And then the Romans conquer the Greeks, and the Romans for a while do the same thing. Well, they're not bothering us, so we're just going to kind of let them do their thing and feel good about themselves. Eventually, the Romans have enough of that and come and overthrow it, and then Rome runs everything. And that's the case when we get to the first century. And Jesus, Rome has now taken control. I say all that to say, real quickly, I want to read a little bit from 1 Maccabees. So 1 and 2 Maccabees is the Jewish retelling of this period of time, from the conquering of Alexander the Great through the end of the rule of the Hasmoneans when Rome takes over again. And I say it's a biased retelling because in the way that it retells it, there's a lot of history in here, but it's told in a way that makes the Jews are always the victims or the good guys. Like they never do anything wrong. And there are some stories in here that you would read and be like, I'm not sure that actually happened. Like it's very fantastic of some tales. And so part of the reason that I'm wanting us to read some of this is, one, to understand why it didn't make it into the Bible, because I've talked about, you might watch something on the History Channel that are like lost books of the Bible that they didn't want you to know about. Well, that's not actually true. First off, we know about them, and secondly, there's a reason they're not in the Bible. So 1 and 2 Maccabees, while it tells some history, it's very biased history, and there's definitely some things in it that are made up. But it also gives us some helpful insight into the New Testament, like the story of Tobit helps us unlock a little bit of that interaction between Jesus and the Sadducees in Matthew chapter 22, and I think Maccabees will help as well. I want to start reading in chapter 1 and verse 29, which is on page 2. So this becomes the retelling of all of this that has happened. When Epiphanes comes and massacres people in Rome and puts his troops there and outlaws Judaism and desecrates the temple. And I want you to put yourself in the shoes of a Jew who's experiencing this and imagine how you would feel. 2 years later, the king sent to the cities of Judah a chief collector of tribute, and he came to Jerusalem with a large force. Deceitfully, he spoke peaceable words to them, and they believed him. But he suddenly fell upon the city, dealt it a severe blow, and destroyed many people of Israel. What's interesting there, I forgot to mention, that there are some Jews who side with the Greeks, not with the Jews who were trying to kick the Greeks out. And this is what he means, that they came in and they spoke these great words and people sided with them, and then they're like, but look what happened. They chose the wrong side. They destroyed many people of Israel. He plundered the city, burned it with fire, and tore down its houses and its surrounding walls. They took captive the women and children and seized the livestock. They fortified the city of David with a great strong wall and strong towers, and it became their citadel. They stationed there a sinful people, men who were renegades. That's the army that they stationed there. These strengthened their position. They stored up arms and food, and collecting the spoils of Jerusalem, they stored them there and became a great menace. For the citadel became an ambush against the sanctuaries, an evil adversary of Israel at all times. On every side of the sanctuary, they shed innocent blood. They even defiled the sanctuary. Because of them, the residents of Jerusalem fled. She became a dwelling of strangers. She became strange to her offspring, and her children forsook her. Her sanctuary became desolate like a desert. Her feasts were turned into mourning, her Sabbaths into a reproach, her honor into contempt. Her dishonor now grew as great as her glory. Her exaltation was turned into mourning. And you begin to see the dislike that Jews had for foreigners. Right? It's all about these foreign people are in our land. Right? They don't belong here. Now imagine in that mindset, you have someone like Paul that shows up on the scene and says, did you know that non-Jews can be a part of the family of Abraham? Imagine how Jews would have taken what Paul says, given the way they're responding just about Gentiles being in their city, let alone Gentiles being a part of the people of God. I'm going to continue reading verse 41, the end of page 2. Then the king wrote to his whole kingdom that all should be one people, and that all should give up their particular customs. All the Gentiles accepted the command of the king. Many even from Israel gladly adopted his religion. They sacrificed to idols and profaned the Sabbath. And the king sent letters by messengers to Jerusalem and the towns of Judah. He directed them to follow customs strange to the land, to forbid burnt offerings and sacrifices and drink offerings in the sanctuary, to profane Sabbaths and festivals, to defile the sanctuary and the priests, to build altars and sacred precincts and shrines for idols, to sacrifice swine and other unclean animals, and to leave their sons uncircumcised. They were to make themselves abominable by everything unclean and profane, so that they would forget the law and change all the ordinances. He added, and whoever does not obey the command of the king shall die. In such words he wrote to his whole kingdom. He appointed inspectors over all the people and commanded the towns of Judah to offer sacrifices town by town. Many of the people, everyone who forsook the law, joined them, and they did evil in the land. They drove Israel into hiding in every place of refuge they had. Now on the 15th day of Chislev, in the 145th year, they erected a desolating sacrilege on the altar of burnt offering. They also built altars in the surrounding towns of Judah and offered incense at the doors and the houses and in the streets. The books of the law that they found, they tore to pieces and burned with fire. Anyone found possessing the book of the covenant, or anyone who adhered to the law, was condemned to death by decree of the king. They kept using violence against Israel, against those who were found month after month in the towns. On the 25th day of the month, they offered sacrifice on the altar that was on top of the altar of burnt offering. According to the decree, they put to death the women, who had their children circumcised, and their families and those who circumcised them, and they hung the infants from the mothers' necks. But many in Israel stood firm and were resolved in their hearts not to eat unclean food. They chose to die rather than to be defiled by food which profaned the holy covenant, and they did die. Very great wrath came upon Israel. So,
You mentioned that the Jews disliked all foreigners.
mhm.
Why did they dislike all foreigners?
It was the belief that as the chosen people of God, they were supposed to be set apart from foreigners, right? But they took that a little too far in that we can't have anything to do with foreigners. Whereas God's intention was be different so that you can be a light to foreigners. They took it as you are to be different from foreigners, and so you get rid of foreigners. You don't have anything to do with foreigners. And part of the reason for that is they believed foreigners led to idolatry. The more you included foreigners, the more they would pull you away from the worship of the one true God, which at times was true.
Look at some.
Yeah, so they have a history of that very thing happening, right?
But the reason they hated foreigners is because of their disbelief and their disobedience. Because every time they did, God allowed them to be overrun and taken into captivity. And it was their own fault that they were in the situation they were.
Exactly. Their disobedience had brought them into this situation. And in that, I mentioned how one of the reasons was they felt like it pulled them to idolatry, and following the law was important. You see here people that were willing to die, rather than specifically it says to eat unclean food. So imagine, you remember the story when God gives those visions to Peter, and you have the blanket that comes down with the unclean food, and Peter doesn't want to do it. Maybe you understand a little bit more why Peter was so hesitant. Like, it was a big deal. Circumcision was a big deal. Circumcision was kind of the badge of the covenant. That's how you knew you were a part of Israel, because only Israel circumcised. And something, if you were to read through 1st and 2nd Maccabees, you see them get mad at, I think I've said this before, so young boys for education would be sent, Greek boys would be sent to gymnasiums. And a part of education in a gymnasium was not only the education of the mind, that was part of it. You would learn math, and you would learn philosophy, you would learn those things, but also the education of the body. So physical activity, that's where we get the term gymnasium today, talking about gyms where you go and physical. But it was more than just physical training, it was also mental training. But all the physical training would be done in the nude. And Jews who were high up in society, particularly within Greek society, it wasn't a good look for them to have their sons at these gymnasiums being educated and doing these sports in the nude and being circumcised, because Gentiles and Romans and Greeks thought that circumcision was just the worst thing ever for someone to do. And so certain higher up Jewish families would actually reverse their children's circumcision. And 1st and 2nd Maccabees deals with that as well. So you talk about how they would kill, or at least they claim that they would kill, those mothers who had their children circumcised. But then you also had some that not only would buy in and wouldn't circumcise the new sons that they had, but actually went and tried to reverse the circumcision of the sons that they had already circumcised, which was all, to most Jews, an abomination, because that was the sign of the covenant, and that was important. Now take that and match that with Paul's discussion of baptism being the new circumcision. Paul's words there are strong when he's talking to Jews, and he says, the badge of membership in the covenant, the thing that you got so upset about because people disregarded, the thing that maybe your grandparents were killed because they followed even when they were told not to. That the new badge of membership is now baptism, which I would imagine Paul would say you hold at just as high of a regard as you have held circumcision throughout your history. Which some of that, I think, goes to show the connections in the New Testament of the way people were thinking. And so that gets me, I've got a couple minutes, but I've got some key themes here that we see in 1st and 2nd Maccabees. Faithfulness to God and to the law, even to death. We just kind of read about that. We're not going to eat defiled food. We're going to circumcise our children, even if we die. That's not that far off from what you see in some of the books of the New Testament. I think of 1st and 2nd Peter. Peter is writing to people who are suffering, and he quotes Exodus and the words that God uses to identify Israel. When he sets Israel apart, he says, "You're my special nation, a holy people. You're set apart, be a light to the world," right? Peter quotes that to the church and says, as followers of Jesus, you're in essence the new people of Israel. You're the new light of the world. You're the new people of God. You're the ones that are holy and have been set apart. You're God's priestly nation to be priests to the world. And he's writing them into the midst of suffering. And his point is, you're strangers and exiles in this world as God's people. Be faithful even in the face of suffering, even in the face of death. That's not far off from the message of 1st and 2nd Maccabees. It's not far off from the message of Judaism as a whole. The message of Judaism being, be faithful even if you die for it. And Peter says to the church, you are the new people of Israel. Be faithful even if you die because of it. Peter isn't making up something new. He's reworking the tradition that he knows and that he grew up in and that his grandparents went through, and he's reworking it and he's now applying it to the church, just like Paul does with baptism being the new circumcision, or the reworking that God does when he gives those visions to Peter. A high value is placed on martyrdom and suffering. So in Maccabees, the people that are celebrated and championed and are believed to be blessed by God are the martyrs, are those who die rather than give up their faith. So I have 1st Maccabees chapter 6 in here. I'm not going to read it, but I would encourage you to read it. It's a story of a mother and her 6 sons, 7 sons, who one by one are scalped and then murdered because they won't give up the law. So one by one they're brought in and asked to give up the law. They're scalped, they're brought in again, give up the law, and then they're killed. And one by one, the mother watches all of this happen to her sons, and then it happens to her. And what you see in that story is that the sons and the mother in the story are talking about how blessed they are to suffer for the sake of the law, and how much God will reward them for dying rather than giving up on the law. Now I say that to say what that does is it creates this idea in Judaism of, in essence, the blessing of being a martyr, of how blessed you are to die for your faith. I see a connection in this thought in Judaism and the book of Revelation, because I think that's the point of the book of Revelation, is that those who die for the sake of their faith don't die in vain. They're the ones who get celebrated. They're the ones who are blessed. They're the ones who are reigning with Christ. It's a very similar sentiment that what you see in 1st and 2nd Maccabees. It's just now been reinterpreted in light of Jesus. It's still holding up the value of suffering and of martyrdom, but now the blessing and the privilege is reigning with Christ. It's not just blessing from the God of Israel, it's blessing with reigning with Jesus for all of eternity, which is the point of Revelation, is they can kill you now, but even if they do, the blessings that come afterwards are so great. And you have the hope of resurrection. I don't know why I didn't put that in. I have it in here later on under importance. But you see the rise of explicit thoughts of resurrection. Of if you die for your faith, that's fine because God's going to raise you up on the last day. And what's interesting about that, and we'll get into that more in a few weeks, what's interesting about that is that if you read the Old Testament, that's not really there. No one in the Old Testament says, well, if you die, that's fine because God's going to raise you up on the last day. It's, you die, that's good because that's what you're supposed to do, and then they just kind of stop there. But by the time you get to the New Testament, all of a sudden there's this idea of, well, if you die, you're going to be raised again. Well, how did we get there? Like, how did this transition happen? Well, you begin to read some of these books and you see that begin to happen. First and Second Maccabees, it kind of sits right in the middle. You begin to have this push in Judaism that martyrdom and suffering are to be celebrated not only because you're blessed by God, but because God will raise you up again, that you will live again, that it's not the end of it, but that when the kingdom comes, you will be raised, which is the very thing that Jesus comes on the scene and begins to preach, is that he's the one who's doing this. He's the one who's bringing about the kingdom of God, where the dead will be raised, where those who are faithful, those who have suffered, those who have been martyred are going to be raised. So Jesus even picks up on these themes that are floating around within the milieu of Second Temple Judaism in the first century. I'm a minute over, so I'm going to end there. We will pick up not next week and not the week after that. We will pick up in 3 weeks. And we will finish talking about the Apocrypha, and we'll move in to talking a little bit about the Pseudepigrapha, and then, let's see, we've done inspiration, we've done canonization, transmission. We'll talk about how the texts of the New Testament were transmitted. How do we know that what we have is what they actually said? And then we'll talk a little bit about translation, English translations of the Bible, how they work, good translations. I think all translations are good if we understand what they're trying to do. So understanding what translations are trying to do. And then in 3 years, we'll move on from this discussion and on to